start and then you'll put the question, right? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I think we are live now. So, hello and a very good evening to everyone. I'm Sanjana and I welcome you all to today's session. This session is a part of our larger project on forced migration under TMYS Review March 2022 in collaboration with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. We are also currently calling for submissions of essays, poems, and stories under the theme of forced migration. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. The topic of today's discussion is child trafficking, investigating the complex cycle of abuse. And to share their views and opinions on this particular theme, we have with us today Professor Ajailiu Niumai, Ms. Hasina Kharbhih, and Mr. Satya Prakash. Needless to say, they have years of experience and are other experts on this topic, and I'm very privileged to be in company of all of you. So before we move on, I would like to quickly introduce our speakers to the audience here tonight. Um, Professor Ajailiu Niumai is Professor of Sociology and Head Center for Study of Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy, University of Hyderabad. She is the Honorary Adjunct Professor, Department of Science and Humanities, National Institute of Technology, Nagaland. She is a member of the Managing Committee of Indian Sociological Society, ISS. She has served as convener of RCO4, Migration and Diaspora Studies of ISS. She has been an active member of the International Sociological Association. Her forthcoming book, co-authored with Professor Abha Chauhan, is entitled Gender, Law and Social Transformation in India by Springer. Satya Prakash is working in the field of child rights and combating human trafficking for more than a decade. The grassroots intervention program of his parent organization, FXP India Suraksha, has now reached out to over 30,000 children. He has been involved in successfully training over 10,000 police officials and other stakeholders on human trafficking and child rights in India. He serves as a member of the research advisory group of the National Resource Center on Child Labor at VV Giri National Labour Institute, uh, an autonomous body of Ministry of Labour and Employment, Government of India. Recently, he was selected by the United States Department of State to represent India in the International Visitor Leadership Program, IVLP, on combating human trafficking. Ms. Hasina Kharbhih is the founder and managing director of Impulse NGO Network. She has been working for 31 years to provide sustainable livelihood to women and children. She created the internationally acclaimed Impulse model, formerly known as the Meghalaya model, a holistic method to address human trafficking. Her work stands on two pillars. The first is Impulse NGO Network, which was conceptualized in 1987 and is a significant force against human trafficking today. The second pillar is Impulse Social Enterprises, which aims to promote local artisans and create sustainable livelihood that helps prevent unsafe migration, which often leads to human trafficking. Currently in the final year of Masters in English Literature from Jadavpur University. I'm deeply interested in the field of migration and I'm a project assistant for TMYS Review March 2022. So I think that's all with the introduction. So without any more delay, I would like to get the session started. First, I would like to call upon Professor Niumai to share her insights regarding today's topic of discussion. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Sanjana, and your team for inviting me. And it's a privilege to speak together with Hasina Kharbhih, whom I have been associating with, and have worked closely to examine trafficking in Northeast India. And we all know that her NGO, Impulse NGO Network, is one of the most prestigious organization with a lot of awards in her feather. So I'm privileged to be a co-panel speaker with her, and also, of course, with Satya Prakash. It's a pleasure knowing you today through this panel discussion. Now, with that few words, I would like to say that I have been working on human trafficking in Northeast region as well as in South India, particularly in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, for the past 13 years. I was involved in some cases of traffic survivors who were repatriated and integrated to their families from Hyderabad to the northeast states, particularly to Manipur and Nagaland. And let me come to the point, of my findings. My uh, most prominent findings is that there is rampant voluntary participation of the traffic victims, mainly because they trust false promises of free education with boarding and lodging facilities or jobs. Interestingly, I also found in my study that the parents and the relatives, they loathe to admit that their children and female relatives have been trafficked because of shame, stigma, and social discrimination. Therefore, I perceive that trafficking is about the neglect of children, especially girl child, from the marginalized tribal community, and also from the northeast region, which is considered important only because of the international strategic borders. My number two point that I want to make is that some of the audience here, online audience, must be wondering how I got involved with this human trafficking research for so long. My research grew out of an accidental conversation with a woman at the Imphal airport in the summer of 2008. I flew to Imphal to spend a month with my family, and while returning on the day when I board the flight to go back to Hyderabad, this lady met me, and I had this conversation where came to know that her younger sister and her friend's daughter had been employed by a recruiting job agent as housemates for an Indian diaspora household in Singapore. And the woman looks poor and also seem worried because her sister has always lived in the village and have never traveled outside before. Another thing I noticed is that obviously she was going to an unknown destination without any familiar people around or any acquaintances. Another thing that I want to draw your attention is that it is not only girls, but boys also fall prey to the traffickers. There are evidences, especially from the Department of Social Welfare, Government of Manipur. Official documents were shown to me, so is by the law enforcement agency, especially the Manipur West Police, have shown records, official records, evidences where young boys from Manipur were sent to be drug peddlers in the international Myanmar border because the region is close to the infamous Golden Triangle, which produces the world's heroin or drugs number 4, locally known as number 4, from the poppy plantations. Another significant point that I like to mention is that children were trafficked mostly by the self-styled religious and charitable institution, ostensibly providing free education and boarding to the poor, which I mentioned in the beginning. And majority of these children ended up in an unregistered children's home in different parts of India, and they were physically, emotionally exploited. My respondents were mostly rescued from Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Goa, Karnataka, and Maharashtra. Another point that I want to share with you is that the Supreme Court's directive to the Northeast states in the year 2010 to prevent children below 12 years from being sent out of the states to pursue their education, and also its directive to the Ministry of Home Affairs to ensure that the Indian armed forces vacate the schools and hostels in the Northeast, which is occupied by them. And then the directive of the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights have actually stopped trafficking to a certain extent. The government of India the Supreme Court and also the Northeast states, they approach the international human trafficking as a national security issue. And another important point that I want to draw from my finding is that the reason for this, children to be abused is rooted or are rooted in the push and pull factors. Now, what are the pull factors and what are the push factors? The push factors include obviously illiteracy and ignorance, and also involves patriarchy and gender inequality, non-implementation of policies by the state government or by the bureaucracy, lack of awareness of rights, particularly human rights, and also child rights, the inaccessibility of the villages located in the hills, and towns in different parts of the Northeast without easy access to schools, lack of road connectivity, electricity, lack of healthcare systems like hospitals, problems stemming from insurgency. As we all know, in a small, tiny state like Manipur, there are more than 30 insurgent groups, even till today, including a sense of insecurity among the parents, about allowing their children to walk to school, or their poverty in the consistent absence of concerned government officials or functionaries at their villages or at the district level and block level to address issues like education, healthcare, drinking water, or any developmental problems of this vulnerable people. Now, these are the push factors. Now, when I look at the pull factors, it includes the unregulated activities of middlemen who facilitate the movement or the mobility or the migration of children from their villages and towns on the pretext of free education or even jobs as housemaids or any other semi-skilled or even unskilled jobs with the knowledge and approval of their families or parents. Now, their unregulated activities include running of illegal and also unregistered shelter homes for commercial purposes for profit. And this lack of regular surveillance. I know that the word surveillance is not really a friendly term in universities across the country since the past 5-6 years. But in this context, you see, when we look at human trafficking, the lack of surveillance, particularly in the villages, in receiving districts by the social welfare department and also by the law enforcement agency who are handling the anti-human trafficking units, makes it easier for this middleman or the traffic agent, the local traffic agent, to operate with ease. Another point is that theoretically speaking, one of the finest social scientists of our 21st century, Manuel Castells, in his book, The Rise of Network Society, focuses on the global criminal economy as an inalienable companion of globalization. And I find that this phenomenon is clearly visible in Northeast India and also as a whole in the entire Southeast Asian countries as the region come closer in the wake of globalization. Another important trend that emerged from my research is that when recruiting agents or the local traffic appear with promises of free education or jobs, they are not questioned by the parents in the tribal hill areas who are often illiterate and trusting. So therefore, the traffickers work openly as placement agents. And then the parents and relatives do not question the intentions of the agents, especially when they are local people, their own local people. And the parents even encourage the children to take advantage of the offers made by these local agents. Ironically, the agents who charge fees are the most trusted during my interview, which is shocking to me. And I realized that when the agent charges fees, the parents and the family members believe that they are genuine. So once their family members, children are gone from their villages, it is hard for these families to pursue the matter with the police, even if they learn that their kids, their children are being exploited. Now, given the close-knit society, rescued victims are reluctant to share their stories, fearing social stigma, and they attempt to hide their identity from strangers, And I was fortunate to do this research, when my research assistant could catch hold of the social activists, as well as take permission from the police to interview these young children, as many as 50, 51 at one go sometimes, in Manipur, as soon as they were rescued and kept in a rehab center. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to interview the survivors. Once they're dispersed and reintegrated with their families after being counseled, it's very difficult for researchers to track down the survivors. Now, some of the questions that I raise is, why do the children continue to become victims of human trafficking in an environment where publicity in law, especially the Supreme Court's 2010 ruling prohibiting sending of children below 12 years outside of the Northeast region, warned against migrating under suspicious circumstances? So this question lead me to examine the efficacy of the state and the NGOs' sensitization and awareness programs. And another question that I raise is, do they reach vulnerable sections of the population? And why do children and women go with the local agent when they are aware of the risk of being trafficked and forced into illegal activities? Now, these are questions that I, raise while going to the field. Now, in terms of law enforcement agency, I know Hasina has been training them for the entire Northeast, so I'm sure that she will throw light on this also. But one must question whether the police have been adequately trained and equipped to enforce anti-trafficking laws. Because when I started my field work in 2009, 8, 9, 10, up to 2012, the police in Manipur are not trained at all. In fact, the IPS officers whom I spoke, 3 of them confirmed to me face to face when I interviewed them in their respective offices that their police forces were not trained. But later on, I challenged them, and later on I know that Hasina is at the forefront of training a huge number of police officials. Another thing that I want to mention is I managed to interview 113 individuals in my first project funded by UGC. And the second project was funded by the Indian Council of Social Science Research, where a huge lot of 179 Nepali nationals were involved, which Hasina's NGO Impulse Network was also a part of that rescuing effort. Now, in this first project, where a lot of children were involved, I could gather data of 113 people, and 6 were boys below 14 years. And the remaining were girls and women. Now, of the total sample of 113, 53% were children below 17 years. 33% out of 113 individuals were women in the age group of 18 years to 35 years, and 14 were obviously older than 36 and 53 years, between 36 to 53 years. Now, I found that efforts to rescue children have been successful in the context of many states of Northeast. For example, there is a pressure group of the Tangkhul tribe called Tangkhul Sanalong. This is a women's pressure group who raided a Gray's home in Rajasthan, in Jaipur, I remember on 12th of March 2013, along with the Rajasthan State Commission for Protection of Child Rights, including the social activists and media persons, after an alert from a local NGO. And they rescued 51 children in the age group of 5 to 11. 29 of them are girls, and 22 were boys. 22 girls hail from Manipur and 3 girls from Nagaland. Now, we couldn't interview all of them, but we managed to meet whole of them, and also managed to interview some of the individuals from this group who were rescued from Jaipur in Imphal before they were reintegrated with their families. We took permission, obviously, and there were 7 boys from Manipur and 4 boys from Nagaland. The local trafficker, on the false promises of free education, shelter, and food, took them to Jaipur from their respective villages after taking consent from their parents. And they were kept in an unauthorized children's home, that is the Grace home in Jaipur. And it was run by a man called Jacob John. Now, these children were not sent to schools, but were forced to make candles and soap and cook and clean and the like. And this person, Jacob John, has sexually and physically abused some of the girls who are in the age group of around 15 to 16. Young girls adapted to the new environment since they were trafficked at a tender age, and some as young as 4 years old. When rescued, many of them communicated in Hindi only and have forgotten their local Tangkhul Naga dialect, which is their mother tongue. In fact, one of the top women leader whom I interviewed in New Delhi told me that the traffickers who pose as agents belong to their same tribe, and therefore the victims' parents and relatives trusted these local agents. Now, let me conclude by stating that children leave their homes with a goal to have better education, to have better economic and social advancement. Now, this seems to be the essential issue that has to be addressed. Both potential victims of trafficking and rescued victims need to be equipped to avoid trafficking or escape from becoming voluntary victims again. The existing laws on anti-trafficking and the actions initiated by the state governments do not address the deep-seated stereotypes of the tribal people from Northeast who have, this Asian feature or the Mongoloid feature, although I hate to use the term Mongoloid because it's considered derogatory, especially in the Western academia. But in India, we comfortably still use the term. Now, as a corrective, the government and NGOs must establish quality school educational institutions with good scholarships for the poor children. Lastly, there should be a massive awareness campaign against human trafficking of children, not only in the Northeast, but across the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Niumai. That was such a comprehensive piece with information and statistics. I'm sure the statistics that you mentioned will help in further research. And it's very interesting to know how you came to be associated with the field of trafficking, research on trafficking. Thank you. And moving on, I would like to invite Mrs. Hasina Kharbhih to talk about her piece on this particular topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sanjana. I will take in from Professor Ajailiu, because the fact that she has worked very closely, I always believe that real action on the ground, when it is actually being supported by academia to give a different perspective of a dialogue, then it always leads to change, which actually leads to a dialogue in policy change. So there's always that interrelation that is very, very important. Whatever subject we are talking, and I think her research has really dived deep, at least in the region that I worked very closely for the many years now. Now, I just wanted to take, I will not repeat what she's already said, but I will just take points from what she just said. When we talk about forced trafficking as the topic of today, I want to highlight that forced trafficking has 2 dimensions. One dimension has been mentioned by Professor right now, where there's a layering issues, people moved out of the region, an unemployment issue. But the other factor of forced, migration that actually leads to trafficking, and especially children, it's something that we don't talk about. It is very often the tea gardens in region like the Northeast, or we're looking at the belt of the North Bengal, the closure of a lot of tea garden because of the economic reason that most of these tea garden are actually run by private entities and private business people, and there has been no support system when the closure happened, because there has not been a support system in terms of even having labor rights that really support children not to be migrating or children not being vulnerable. We have seen that government official still would recruit children to work in their home. So that is a very common, I would say a common factor that happens. And we see that day in and day out. Many organizations who work on labor, and I think Satya will also, agree with me because they also work very heavily on this issue, is that government official by the notification are never supposed to have child labor working in their house. But what we have seen in the practical reality, that not only in the northeast of India, in the entire country in India, that most of these government officials would not take into the element of the law, but will still want cheap labor. That is something that we need to look closely, especially now with COVID-19, also with the fact that forced labor will increase. It's already increasing because a lot of family have lost their employment, have lost their economic, and children become more vulnerable. And business people who have lost the businesses will always look for cheap labor. So the dynamic of forced labor will increases, and trafficking of these children for forced labor will be one dimension which needs to be addressed very, very closely. Not that labor issue has never happened over the years. In 31 years of my work, we have seen the dynamic of forced labor. Labor want is economic issues of family, unemployment always lead to families sending the children to work, and very often they get trafficked and sexually exploited, especially the girl child. The second aspect is that unless until we strengthen the economic system, our own experiences of the last 31 years is that creating economic value chain in the vulnerable communities, especially the indigenous population of the Northeast, that where we are starting to work in the last 14 years, through a hybrid model, which is the social impact business, strengthening the economic, help them not to send the children to work is one way of addressing forced labor, because you cannot stop family to send people out or their children out or getting vulnerable if they don't have economic sustainability or they don't have the food security. So that is one aspect which is a dynamic that has increased and has happened and it's continuing to happen. The other is that many often the stringent part of the law will need to be taken much more stronger by organization, by law enforcement, that if children are being found being employed by government official, they have to take this notification very seriously, that they should get prosecuted. They cannot just be allowed to not be prosecuted, because we are seeing that these employment happen in many states of the northeast, where you find government official having forced labor coming there in their own home, and their simple answer is that, oh, we are taking care of them, we're sending them to school, they're having good food, they're playing with our children. But the ground reality and the ground existence of the cases that we have dealt is not like that. The other factor of looking at forced migration, we also have to see the dynamic of forced migration. Now, we as an organization experiences, especially with the coal mining, which is called the rat hole mining in the state of Meghalaya. Yes, 14 years of our work in that has led to the closure of the coal mine that was actually bringing in traffic labor from across the border of Nepal and Bangladesh, who are being used to work in these hazardous situations of rat hole mines where only children can crawl. And most of the children who are being used here are basically children who are not from the same region but are being trafficked to these mines. So these economic issues that actually brings upon, because most of these mines are owned by powerful people. Yes, we managed to get a closure after we filed a public interest litigation in 2014. But the real fact is that the illegal mining, as we call, is still happening in the nooks and corners of all these mines. So that is one dynamic of it, that policies are there, laws are there. You file a public interest litigation, you bring in the essence of stopping forced labor and migration, which is leading to exploitation. But we also needs the power of the community, the power of the voice of the people to say, no, we don't want children to be employed in hazardous situation. So that awareness has to be more powerful, especially in today's world where we see the use of media or the use of social platform has become more of a platform that communicate and bring voices. So that's very important. The other factor is that young people, creating that awareness that they should not agree if the family is actually employing children in their home is another way, because that is where young people mindset has to be changed in the whole process. And we'll still see that the situation of COVID, as we have already been seeing now, that many children will become more vulnerable, and we are seeing that entire migration taking place. The other factor that I want to highlight is that when we are talking about forced labor, we also have to see that the Eastern Himalayan belt has many international borders. And these international broad borders, till today, has a lot of similarities in terms of cultures, and also the fact that when there is any kind of disruption in one place, or we are looking at any kind of social unrest, we always see displacement taking place. Displacement also lead to a lot of forced migration among vulnerable communities. If we're looking today at the factor of the three, four major states of the Northeast, like Manipur, Nagaland, and Mizoram, we're having more and more people displaced from Myanmar coming down to the Northeast, and the support system that is not available is also making children vulnerable who are being displaced. So we become the recipient. So there has to be a collective action of governments, especially when we are talking about displaced people, when we are talking about children, because we as a country ourselves has signed the Convention on the Right of a Child. So whether we are a state that is receiving, a country that is receiving, or a country that is a source, we need to adhere by those conventions, because those conventions are directive for the government, for nonprofit organization, to see that how we can respond to forced migration. And that powerful voice cannot be one single organization. Data, like what Professor has just mentioned, are way forward of bringing this dialogue and the essentialities of how a single window platform can actually generate a powerful way of addressing an end-to-end situation of forced migration, and also the violence that these children has to undergo. And when it's come to a girl child, the vulnerability is much, much more higher. And that's how sexual exploitation and trafficking is the interlink, the inter effect of it. So by and large, if we are talking of real ground situation, we also have to see the changing dynamic of economics, the changing trade relation between countries, the situation of COVID that is actually going to make businesses recruit more children in their workspace if there's no strong vigilance that is going to be created. So what has happened in the past will be more now. So there has to be interlinkages of work between organization with experiences, a new organization that are working out there, universities that can also become the bridge of making government see the reason of how one can address forced migration. Unless things can actually goes into a large scale situation of where rescue can take place. But how much rescue if we don't have these vigilance that actually interface prior to the factor that these children are being trafficked? So that is our ground experience, looking at the interface at the moment, looking at cross-border trade, looking at displacement. And since we work in the neighboring countries of Nepal, Bangladesh, and Myanmar through our country partners and our state partners in all the northeastern state, we as organization, as groups together, basically come up with this voice that there has to be a need of sharing of resources, sharing of interlinkages, and less forced labor dynamic will be a big challenge for many, many for many one of us. And I think we'll open up for questions after this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kharbhih. That was quite informative, and it was quite interesting to look at how you pointed out the hypocrisy prevalent in society in terms of wanting cheap labor, etc. We'll obviously touch upon the points that, delve into the points that you mentioned in more detail in the question answer segment. Moving on, I would like to invite Mr. Satya Prakash to share his insights on this topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sanjana. Thank you, Tell Me Your Story, for organizing such a wonderful interaction, which is so important to hear and go back to the history. So for Professor Niumai, what she shared about the Jaipur case, FXB was part with the Tangkul Snalong because we work in Rajasthan and we were the complainant. We are still fighting this case in Jaipur. And this was an interesting insight for FXB, and this goes back in year 2013 when I personally visited for the first time and interacted with the government officials and with the victims. To be very honest, from then and now, FXB has been working on prevention of trafficking very closely with the Social Welfare Department and the state of police and the Assam Rifles, paramilitary who safeguard the Myanmar and Manipur borders. Things has changed from then and now. It's been because what I'm going to be focusing is more mix up of research, which we keep on doing for generating evidences, as well as our ground experience on rescue and rehabilitation. So definitely the points which Hasina and Professor has raised is very pertinent. And I'm sure with their vast experience of working in the Northeast and across India, it sets up a parameter. How do we really look at this whole paradigm in and around human trafficking? Now, my personal opinion that the migration is your human rights. You cannot force them not to migrate for better opportunities, aspiration. I mean, youth primarily they have access to technology and they aspire to become responsible citizen. And definitely in the due course, they come across with these starts and middleman or what you call the placement agents. Uh, Very interestingly, I'll touch around. One of the study which I was personally involved in conducting with the FXB Center for Human Rights, Harvard University, and this was looking at the connection between source and destination, and and that was one of our interesting idea that even these far-flung places within the Northeast, the trafficking takes place to the North India to southern part of the country, and then rescue is just the beginning of the story. I would say the nightmare, and then the whole issue around the rehabilitation and the reintegration. Uh, where does it get lost? I mean, something which concerns each one of us who's practicing on the issue of human trafficking. And as part of this study, because this is the phenomena, we did this study back in 2016, but still this practice is continuing. And in and around this COVID time, maybe we could see that the magnitude has gone up, though we lack the statistical evidences to support this fact. But the practical experience does say that the number has increased. Now, between Rajasthan and Bihar, because we were looking at when these children are rescued and they are sent back to the source state, how this whole process of rehabilitation and reintegration takes place. And that's something throws us a serious concern that, when the practices at the destination is something is very ad hoc. When you look at how the FIR been registered, if you look at how the investigation are being conducted, and just to connect the dots, what happens in the Manipur and the Jaipur Rajasthan case, we have a better example that it's almost like 8 years now. And some of these girls has been married. When it comes about for testimony or deposing in the court, that becomes one of the major challenge. And a couple of them have already turned hostile. Now, how do we, as an organization who is one of the complainant, take this case forward. And that's where what I strongly feel when it comes about victim, there's barely any incentive for them to cooperate in this whole criminal justice system we are activating. And that somewhere throws a light as an organization how you want to get associated. Rescuing is not sufficient when it comes about process of getting rehabilitated and reintegration. The kind of support which these government organizations require is something very ad hoc and is still challenging. And when you look at the legal purview, we do have strong laws, but when it comes about execution and implementation, it causes a great threat to us, because as Hasina said, the incidences like what she shared is not something which has stopped. We are still experiencing, and as an FXP, we run a hotline number, which is from the Ministry of Women and Child Development, the child helpline for Noida as well as for Ukrul in Manipur. It shares the same, the stories are the same, but what is important that you have to keep on engaging with the government agency. There will be a different priority, but to tell you that the government now, they are concerned about these issues around human trafficking. And we are very privileged that the case which was shared that way back in 2019, Impulse was also, Hasina and the team was also involved in these Nepalese citizens who were rescued at the border of at More in India and Myanmar border. Uh, this whole process of rehabilitation was something which was challenging. The way they were repatriated back to Nepal without following this whole protocols through a very serious concern. But I'm glad that the government was very interested to set up a standard protocol, and FXC was appointed as a drafting agency for developing a SOP for the state of Manipur, looking at these local context. Uh, the point that when we are in 2021 looking at the ecosystem in and around human trafficking, it's very dynamic. Things have changed drastically. And you, as you all know, that and that's interesting for our listeners and viewers, that we are in a process of getting a new legislation around human trafficking. But the point that whether this new legislation is going to be addressing this issue of human trafficking is something we all need to discuss and debate in detail. But looking at the existing paradigm, be it about the juvenile justice and how it's been executed and how it's been implemented, be it about the issue of child labor or human trafficking, I mean, that's bother each one of us, and that's somewhere I feel that the agenda of interagency coordination is completely missing. Either we look at that it's a police role, it's a role of the social welfare department, and it's the role of the uh, judiciary, but somewhere or the organizations who are involved or activating cases like this. This really calls for stronger collaboration, and which Hasina has, interestingly reflected in her talk. That is something which is missing at the moment. Police has a very limited role to play. When I bring in the role of paramilitary, for their role is pretty limited, but they play a very critical role. And that's where we need to identify, we need to bring them on board, and we need to engage them on a timely basis. It should not be on an event that we do one training program and then you leave them aside. There has to have a process of continuum, and that's where bringing it back the study, the finding of the study is available on our website. Anybody who's interested, please visit our website and download. You can read the report. What we did in 2016, the findings are still relevant as of now. The practice hasn't stopped. The magnitude of the children who have been trafficked from Bihar to Rajasthan, the number, probably you could find them that they are trafficked in hundreds. So 700, 800 children are being rescued from Jaipur. And definitely, the cheap labor is one of the basic reason. But coming back and doing a kind of empirical study that what kind of background or the social fabric they are coming from, that's something's called for a stronger attention around prevention. And the prevention should not be just limited for children who are in a distress or who could be vulnerable for trafficking, but the benefits should also reach out to the families so that you create an ecosystem which is healthy and protected. And that's somewhere what I feel while you're practicing, our focus just get limited to the victim. We forget about what's happening with the family. And in this context, recently, with the U.S. TIP Office and Asia Foundation, FXB did a study on gender-based violence and human trafficking. And interestingly, we talked to police officers, judges, prosecutors, and so as to the victims, and as well as the organization who are working in this landscape. The story has been very interesting. They tell that the police, they gets confused with the legal provisions which are available, and they're not able to apply the sections or which are appropriate in a case. And that's where, as a practitioner, what I find that they keep on committing a mistake between human trafficking, migration, and smuggling. And that's something also emerges when I do passionately training these paramilitary as well as the state police force, that the thin line they are unable to identify. And that's but at the same time, it's very interesting, either Ministry of Home Affairs through the Bureau of Police Research and Development or through the state police unit, they have been focusing about how to train the anti-human trafficking unit, as well as the other police units who somewhere have to play a vital role in intercepting or intervening in the cases of human trafficking. Secondly, is all about the service provision. If you look at this whole situation around human trafficking, the services, be it about shelter home, be it about provision of rehabilitating services, it's largely concentrated to the bigger cities. What's happening to the smaller cities? One case study which Professor has shared, and I'll dwell upon the same. Ukhrul, which is a hilly, beautiful district in Manipur, with Tangkhul's inhabited society, barely they don't have those kind of services who could provide the appropriate rehabilitated having service to the victims. Now, this is not something new. If you look at across India, these services largely being concentrated to the bigger cities. Though I'm very hopeful that with the government intervention, be it about setting up a one-stop crisis center, child helpline, or supporting Ujjwala or Sadar homes, down the line will improve the quality of services. But at the same time, what I strongly believe, the government agencies, the law enforcement agencies, as well as the organizations who are working in this space, they need to join hand together. And this is not something which I'm talking for the first time. People working in this space, they have been advocating, and I know personally Hasina has been doing brilliant work around this. But still a lot to be done. I strongly feel a lot to be done, and that's where when I talk about research, I strongly feel that it has to be on action-based research, so that it can influence the government agency, so that they can take references when they are revisiting their policies or their schemes. So as for the organizations who are working in this area, that they look around the recommendations, which are pretty important. As I said, the 2016 studies recommendation are still relevant, and it's not something that the law around child labor has changed, but the the issue around rehabilitation, reintegration has remained the same. With my current experience of engaging with the actors who are working closely in the issue of child labor or other forms of trafficking, they do lack those kind of skills, and just a couple of trainings is not going to help them. So how do you provide that kind of continuous hand holding will actually hold a success mantra for them. And that's where what I feel that as one of the takeaway for these agencies, that we need to be proactive rather than reactive, and that's call for maybe identifying the vulnerable groups, identifying the hotspot, identifying the newer destinations, because down the line the definition and the whole understanding of destination has changed. Newer places has emerged where probably the law enforcement may not be that active to identify, oh, we may experience a case of human trafficking here. So I think very strongly this is a process in continuum. We have heard about a decade or more than a decade of experiences, but it calls for a stronger collaboration. And maybe even we do keep on seeing the space that the new standard protocols are being developed, new SOPs are developed, but how far it's being executed, how far this is being really helpful and used up by these agencies is something is also questionable. If there's a gap in the law, we feel that a SOP or a protocol or an advisory for that matter will help, will fill the gap. But in practice, it doesn't. It's again remain the prerogative of these officers that they know about these advisories and they want to use it. So, what I strongly feel that whatever the gaps we have it and the experiences we have in the ground, we need to bring it as part of the law. Otherwise, we're gonna be just passing on ball from one court to the other. So maybe I'll rest here. We can go on for the discussion in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your insightful points, especially about the recommendations for prevention strategies, and particularly as when you talked about interagency coordination. I will now like to move on to our brief question answer segment. And my first question is for Ms. Hasina Kharbhih. And I know when you talked about your piece, you had already mentioned about the rat hole mines, but I would like to focus more. I would like you to focus more on that. And the question is, a study conducted by Impulse in Human Rights Now focused on the Jaintia Hills in the state of Meghalaya, where the mining industry has grown over the past 30 years. These rat hole mines are known to employ and exploit thousands of children and minors. Could you shed some light on this issue? As in, I would want you to focus on the more complex bits of it when you were actually involved in the process.
Thank you for that question. I think when I go back, coal mining in the state of Meghalaya has been there for more than 30 years. It is traditionally, in fact, being implemented in terms of the mining. It's not scientific, but it's traditional in nature. And that's the reason it's called rat hole mining, because they will have 145 feet deep in, and and the square, they would have these rectangular kind of hole, which is really haphazardly, not really scientific, and they need children to actually do the mining. And that's why this name rat hole has been the parameter of description of how children are being used. Now, as an organization that was actually working on the issue of child trafficking, when we initially started the Impulse model, we had cases of children that has been referred from Nepal to us asking their whereabouts. It's basically, the inter-cross border whereabout that they have been trafficked for labor to Meghalaya, and they happens to be in the Jaintia Hills, which happen to be the major coal mining area. Now, having said that, our first intervention, believe it or not, when I look back at the whole process, I never could believe that my state was a destination point for children who have been forced, to be used in these rat hole mine. And realizing that we know that there was coal mining and mining was in existence. Now, different steps has been taken by the organization. Step one was mapping. Step two was conducting research in collaborative with universities and other organizations, international organizations like Asian Human Rights and others, putting up these reports to the state government, to the labor, name it, all the system. I will not want to name everything right now, but everybody in the state was appraised of the finding, but none of these departments would actually take action. So that has actually, took us almost in a period of 3 years knocking our doors, with the findings. Then the step two, when we realized that the dynamic that these minds are owned by the most powerful people, will never allow any department, to intervene in the way it's supposed to be intervened. Like I think what Satya said, we have all these laws, but the action on the ground needs to be done. You need to get prosecution. So step two for us was that we need to have consultative, discussion about the findings. We took that. We got a lot of response from various institutions across the states, across I would say India and across the globe about the ground situation of mining. But then that did not lead us, till we took the third step where we filed complaint to all the commissions in the country, from Asian Human Rights, I would say National Human Rights Commission, Child Right, name it, we file all complaint with all the fact finding. We had all the visits by them in 2 years, where directive to the state was already being given, what they're supposed to do by the law, by the child labor laws, and all of it. Still, the buy time factor happened in a system where no action really took place, where the closure happened to take place. So we went to the fourth step. We engaged to use all our findings systematically, engaging international media to report ground zero with us, where we help most of the international media. Of course, many organizations then did not really understand the interlink between research and media. We realized that the power of media, if it's utilized in the right direction, and if the research can be taken from ground zero to tell the world, then you need a better voices to a ground situation where we have failed, to get response of all the steps that is required. And that actually led to an international, intervention in which it was taken to the UN Special Rapporteur. It was actually discussed. There has been, directive from the UN Special Rapporteur to the three country of source, transit, and destination, and that made it much more stronger in the way it was discussed. But then that did not stop the mining. The mining continued to happen. And then the last resort for us is we collected all the evidence, annexed it to our PIL, public interest litigation. But we consciously took to file this PIL in the National Green Tribunal. I know there was a question then that Impulse could have filed it in the Supreme Court. We didn't want to file it in the High Court because we knew that it would completely take, dates after dates. And because of the power and the nexus, it would not have allowed us to get, I would say, an audience of what we file. But we took it at National Green Tribunal for the reason. The purpose one was there was already a PIL on child labor by Kailash Satyarthi and his team, the Bachpan Bachao Andolan, where we are also a signatory as organization in the country. But we felt that if we would file there, they would have clubbed it together. But the dynamic of the rat hole mining was different. It was traditional mining. Land ownership was very different. It was basically, the land ownership itself, in a customarily and sixth schedule is completely very different. We don't want that to actually be dismissed of the ground reality. So we filed it in the National Green Tribunal. And in one hearing, we got an order. So it was one of the most powerful order of closure of mine that looked at from the directive of climate, environment, and children being used. And that is where in 2014, we brought up this whole process that how research, media, and organization working together, evidence-based, take it up to get that closure. Of course, the closure was a landmark, but children was basically, we wanted compensation for all the children, because we have to get them rescued, send them back. And it was not possible only for Impulse as one organization to do all the rescue and all the compensation. The government needs to act upon it. Now, that was when the dynamics of the next step. So I think I agree with Satya said that, rescue, order, closure, there's the other process of it. So we worked through it from 2014 till now. And believe it or not, that it's only in the recent years when there were collapse of mine that there was some, unauthorized mining taking place after closure, that it became an India debate at the Prime Minister's office. Until then, nobody was talking about it because that is the area that brings revenue, and nobody wanted to do scientific. Although the National Green Tribunal has mentioned as a directive that they need, a policy for mining that will not include children, but did not happen till today. So you can see we got a closure. We managed to save a lot of children. Impulse are still sponsoring a lot of children in Nepal right now. Not all of them, it's not possible. We mapped more than 70,000 children based on factual and the number of being recruitment. But still, the rehabilitation part, that per law that the country needs to do, is still a big challenge. And we still continue to fight with that. So that is where, when we talk about working on issue which is larger, it really require multiple system change. It require multiple engagement, because the government was completely not wanting to admit that they had a problem of child labor. I mean, when I was personally attacked, when my driver died, when I took this whole campaign together, I was told that people from Nepal look so small, and I imagine they were children. So imagine that kind of statement go to the legislative assembly. So you can imagine, what you face. I'm saying children, and they saying that the people coming from the mountain look small, and I imagine they are children. So that is where system, judiciary, legislative needs to also be part of the process, where we have to engage and lobby. Unless you win a battle, I don't deny it was a huge hard work, not just by myself, but a huge team that worked and supported our work together, partners. But the end result, we still need great rehabilitation. We need to have a closure completely. So that is where the process, but of course, I'm happy that it sent the strongest message. It brought us at risk, but it collapsed the previous government. It got a new government, but still that doesn't end. It needs require more efficiency in the way it has to be dealt.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for your answer. My next question is for Professor Niumai. I know you've touched upon this point already, but still, one of your papers titled The Politics of Trafficking Amongst Tribal Women in Manipur, Northeast India, talks about how globalization has an effect on the flesh trade of tribal women and children. Would you like to elaborate on that, or broadly talk about what you meant by this term, politics of trafficking?
Yeah, thank you for the question. When I wrote Politics of Trafficking, I mean the anti-trafficking paradigm. How the law enforcement agency were involved in trafficking, but the top rung officials were not fully 100% committed in involving in this issue, but the lower rung officials were more committed in my research findings. And I realized that there is less fun in the trafficking unit. So the top rung law enforcement officials are more keen to look into more lucrative kind of activity, like, for example, insurgency or drug mafia, or other lucrative kind of projects, rather than look into this. And another thing is that the young girls' bodies are being commercialized and commodified in the global market, in the flesh trade, as a cheap labor or as a sexual object, objectifying their body, and considered as exotic spices of Southeast Asia in the global market, in Malaysia, Singapore, or the Middle East, and how they look at these bodies, young bodies, as a space to make surplus value. And another thing is that there are, in my findings, I found a lot of small NGOs who have never worked on trafficking. But when I started researching, there are people who came forward saying, I have Swadhar home, I have shelter, Ujwala home. I work on trafficking. So when I go deep into conversation and visit the NGOs, they have never done any work on NGOs. But they see money in this, funding in this from the international funding agencies. So this is the kind of politics of trafficking that I referred to, Sanjana.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your response. It was really interesting. Uh, Moving on, sir, my next question is to you. Uh, you have already focused on the study and its results of between FXB and the FXB Center for Public Health in Harvard University. So I will not delve into that question, but could you shed some light on the gaps in the implementation of child trafficking laws in India and their reform? I know you mentioned about the very pertinent topic of interagency coordination, but if you could also focus on some of the gaps or if there are any lacks in it. So,
No, thank you, Sanjana. So, before I get into your question, I just want to present one fact which Professor Niumai has said about the Swadhar homes. So, when we were doing this study, recent study with the US TIP office, Manipur has a 16 district, even after the new district which was formed. You will be amazed that there are 19 Swadhar homes, and we all, sorry, 19 Ujwala homes. And Hasina, Ujwala homes are meant for traffic survivors. And Delhi has none. Delhi has none. So the point about how these resources are, distributed is something we need to closely review. Whether these resources, because if you look at the reported incidences of human trafficking, at least when you rely on the NCRB data, the National Crime Record Bureau data, it does not indicate that the numbers are huge when it comes out Manipur. But definitely they have it. So that's one of the example, or I would probably say the tip of the iceberg, which calls for a closer review. Definitely each district should have these basic services, but how these services are distributed, this call for a very close attention. Now, coming back to the question, and definitely I reflected that the study which was done in 2016, the findings and the recommendations are still valid. And I'm so glad recently when I was inducted as member of with the VV Green National Liver Institute, we wanted that the law does not offer each and everything. When you are trying to look at in terms of services, it has, so even let's say after 1986 we amended our child and adolescent labor. It does not call for looking from a single lens, that whether it's a child labor incidence or whether it is also linked with trafficking. And that's where most of the training and the sensitization program primarily taking place with the police, this need to be touched upon, that how there is a linkages between labor and the trafficking incidences. And I don't really need to stress upon, because if you look at the NCRB data, the top two remains either trafficking for sexual exploitation or trafficking for forced labor. And that's where like for me in Rajasthan, where we were doing this study, in most of these child labor cases, they included the relevant section of human trafficking as well, because the modus operandi was such that you can easily associate with that violation. Now, does it really help on the ground? It does. Because if you look at the kind of punishment which is there under the child and the adolescent labor, and the punishment under the 370 IPC for human trafficking, 370 offers better, basket of services when it comes from criminal justice point of view. But the problem remain at the first juncture. How do you identify that this is a case of a human trafficking? How do you identify it's actually a real victim? How do you then add particular sections around human trafficking or violation of child labor? And then further go on looking for the kind of services required to rehabilitate. So you see, in this whole journey, the mistake starts from the first place itself, which is about identifying the victim. And that's where I'm so happy, and unofficially I was sharing with Hasina as well. We are in a process of developing a indicator tool for the law enforcement, so that they should have an handy tool, so that they are able to identify and place that, oh yeah, it's a victim for labor or sex, and what are the different maybe the processes which are involved and associated in this whole journey of exploitation. And that's where I always advocate that human trafficking is not a one-off event. It's a chain of exploitation. You undergo through different experiences, and each need to be addressed appropriately. And coming back, one of the thing that I said that even when these children are being rescued from labor, there is a lot of anomaly. There is no standardized process when it comes about registration of FIR. And they get into this whole debate about cognizable and the non-cognizable offense. And that's what afraid me. Because the new amendment within the JJ Act, it makes the provisions non-cognizable. So for me, whatever there is a violation of Juvenile Justice Act, which involves children being trafficked or children being, engaged in labor, these will becomes a non-cognizable offense. Now, how it will help a law enforcement, how it will help a police. So these kind of changes and amendments are also going to have a long lasting impact about the overall processes. And finally, as I said, that we had an experience way back in 2015 where we saw that over 800 children being trafficked from one district of Bihar, which is Gaya, to Jaipur in Rajasthan. Now, that trend hasn't changed. If you look around the recent BBC story, I mean, they were reporting the same kind of narratives. Now, how much we have changed? So, the kind of pressure these destination government are handling, because it is being widely reported in the media, and Hasina can connect back to these over 200 Nepalese citizens when they were rescued. The kind of media attention and the government to handle those kind of pressure, because you become automatically responsive. What are we doing? And the service, I mean, your services are not standardized to take care as per the protocols. And the kind of hurriness you show in sending them back to the source. And Hasina can directly connect the whole process about home investigation. That still remains a huge challenge. How do you really beforehand sending the victim back to the source? Now, how efficiently you conduct this study, so that either it can help the child welfare committee when it comes about a child, or even for a special court under ITPA to take a decision that whether it is safe and appropriate to send back the victim to home or not. And adding on the kind of services which are required which can successfully rehabilitate. Now these two elements are missing. So even doesn't matter you make any stringent law, I will have a serious doubt, though I mean, you should not consider that I'm trying to be very negative, but I'm very an optimistic person, but I want that, just putting a reformation in the law will not solve the purpose. We need a greater and a better engagement, which has to be seen in continuum. Yeah. Thank you, Sanjana.
Thank you so much, sir. That was
Sanjana,
such
I
an
might just want
insightful
to add,
piece.
if you don't mind, I'll
Yes,
just
yes,
add a
yeah,
little bit to
absolutely.
what you just said. So I think looking at that particular case of migration from Nepal, via the chicken neck to Manipur and then to Myanmar. The interesting part of this whole bit, because since we were also working in Myanmar, uh, the rescue that happened of those who've managed to cross the border, because we had to send them back to Nepal, And when our team was in Manipur, and our program managers and case manager was in Manipur to actually facilitate the relationship between the state of Manipur, the embassy of Nepal, and our counterpart partner in Nepal. The force, very often, what happened is that when there's no conversion of State Department, then you see the divide that happened between a labor department, a social welfare, a child welfare committee. I think that was a particular case that I think Satya would really want to highlight, because it's a learning lesson. If we take that as a learning lesson, then the state would be able to be more progressive to handle future cases rather than each one of them, because they were isolating even our team. Like, we work very closely with the anti-human trafficking units, who are our window to all the network in the state and our state partner. But when our team were there, I mean, the fact that social welfare didn't want to communicate more with anti-human trafficking, and all of that dynamic is a great learning lesson. And in a positive note, I think, professors also agree, because she's done this research. If we don't bring these together,
Whatever you mentioned, I have heard it from the ground level during my fieldwork in
I
2018.
know. So I think if we don't really bring that and be honest to a reality ground check, we'll face the same incident again and again and again. So the law will still be there, but the incident will happen. So working rules, as we might call it. We don't need too many law. We can be innovative. I mean, we've been innovative. I mean, there has been successes in our journeys. There have been challenges in our journey of 31 years. But the ground reality here is that unless we bring that convergence, the divide will happen, because the pressure from the media will sometimes bring officer to isolate, in doing the work. Some will do it proactively. And who suffer? The non-profit organization who's trying to bridge the gap are swimming in between both. So we really need, I mean, if it is going to be the trafficking bill right now, that should give directive of interagency working, of how organization should be worked, how these case studies should be reviewed, to see that the bill can be more a proactive working rule has to be developed. We are really pushing working rule in every state, because we don't need laws anymore. Enough. India has too much of laws. But proactively, we need that collaborativeness, right? And sometime, I think, as human being, organization, not every organization, from our experiences, are coming together to work. We still work in isolation. So how do we bridge that ego of working together is also a big question mark, right? So I think that question, Satya, I know you all were dealing, our team was dealing with that particular case. But I think from the policy point of view, or if we're looking at from the next research point of view, Professor, I think universities, I mean, who's actually putting this discussion today, should start looking how we can help country to facilitate ground action, and see that the bill become more progressive in the future. Unless we'll reinvent the wheel again and again. And having been in this field for so long, there are times I keep hearing the same thing, right? When I'm sitting in a meeting. So, and I think as professor would say, you hear the same thing happening on the ground. How do we change that entire cycle? So that's very critical and important.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your additional point. And I think that's a wonderful point with which we can bring this session to an end. Thank you very much for taking out the time and joining the discussion tonight, taking into account this entire scenario of global human rights, and putting in, if we add the COVID pandemic to it, it adds like one more layer of complexity to all the situations. And therefore, I think this was an extremely pertinent thing that we had this discussion here. Thank you, dear panelists, and a very good night to all of you.
Thank you for
Thank
inviting
you.